Good afternoon again. I hope you had a wonderful lunch. My name is Martina Mastin, and I'm the faculty director of Wendy Gillespie Center for Advancing Global Business here in San Diego State University. Our center is one of 16 centers of excellence in the United States, as designated by the U.S. Department of Education. And our mission is to be a catalyst for global thought leadership by connecting international commerce and academia. And in our center, we have collaborated with the Lavin Entrepreneurship Center over the years, particularly in the area of international entrepreneurship. And we are truly proud to be the sponsors of the next keynote that is going to be given by Dr. Lois Shelton. I have known Lois for many years. I have met her for the first time, actually, 9 years ago at this conference. And so I'm truly honored to introduce her. Dr. Shelton, if you don't know her, she's a professor in CSU Northridge. She's a very active researcher and obviously entrepreneurship educator. She has served as a co-editor of International Journal of Entrepreneurial Behavior and Research. Dr. Shelton received her PhD and MBA from Harvard University. And she's currently also on the editorial review board of Journal of Business Venturing. And so she's going to be here to present a fascinating talk on doing context, motivating learner, and inspiring research, a kaleidoscopic view of entrepreneurship. So help me welcome Dr. Shelton.
Oh, Martina, thank you so much for that generous introduction. It's truly an honor to be here. And I want to take this time to just share some thinking that I've been doing about the whole idea of context. And I want this to be interactive. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear some of the things that you are thinking of about this topic as well. So I think I'm going to first start out with some examples. Let's say there's a situation where we have a woman entrepreneur who's pitching to an all-male group of investors. She decides to change her style of pitching. Another scenario, there's a team of entrepreneurs who are lobbying for new ways to raise capital, and they succeeded to do this. That's the result of the Jumpstart Our Business Startups Acts, the Jobs Acts of 2012, which led to legalizing equity crowdfunding. And then there's another scenario about a business owner who relocates his facility to increase access to skilled labor. I want to suggest that all these scenarios have to do with entrepreneurs impacting the context in which they are operating, in the context in which they're doing business, in the context in which they're functioning. And I think that's a key part of context that I want to start to discuss today. I want you to join me in exploring another view of context, from moving the whole idea of context from something that's static, invisible, immovable, and in the background, to thinking of it as something that's interactive, evident, and changeable. Those three scenarios I presented earlier today in this talk represent entrepreneurs who are changing their context in order to achieve their goals. And in some respects, the context also is changed in response to the motivations and the actions of entrepreneurs. So here in this viewpoint that I'm presenting right now and I'm sharing with you right now, doing context is about the interplay between entrepreneurs and their environments. It's not something that's static. It's not something that sticks around. It's not something that is completely in the background. But here I'm thinking in the next sort of way of thinking about context, in this perspective, it's about interplay, interaction, changes, and impact on processes and outcomes. So let's start with a few definitions here. I talked about a kaleidoscope. And one of the reasons I wanted to sort of label this perspective that I've been thinking about a kaleidoscope, because if you know about a kaleidoscope, if you change one thing, the entire outcome changes, okay? And I think that's a way to sort of, a good visual for the way I've been sort of thinking about context. It's just, you can make one change in the context, and that can completely change the entrepreneurial outcome, the entrepreneurial processes. And I want to suggest that this is an additional way to start thinking about the whole issue of context, which has become much more popular in recent years. A second definition, just so we can be all on the same page, is environment. Because when I'm talking about doing context, I'm talking about the interplay between an entrepreneur or his or her environment. And so let's think about what environment is. And these definitions I'm presenting here are from our illustrious resource, dictionary.com. But I want you to focus on a few things here. One is it talks about habitat, situation, circumstances, conditions, and domain. And another thing talks about ecology, and as entrepreneurship researchers and teachers, we talk a lot about ecosystems. It's basically all external factors surrounding and affecting an organism at any given time. Okay, so this idea of environment is pretty all-encompassing. And in a framework that I sort of share with my students, it has to do with sort of dividing it up into a number of levels: the micro individual level, the meso, which is the community or cultural level, and then the macro, which is the institutional level. Okay? And so here we finally get to the idea of context. One of the key things I want to point out to you from our discussion here is that earlier, in one of the things of environment, it also talked about relationships. And here in context, we're talking about things that influence the meaning or the effect. And I think that's the key thing about context. One thing we think about is, and one of the discussions we have, it's so broad, it's so wide. And I'm going to discuss ways that I think we can narrow it down. But the key thing there is that it imbues meaning, it imbues a holistic meaning to it, it imbues results simply because of the different contexts. So here in this perspective that I've been thinking about that I wanted to share with you all today, it is a focus on interactions, the causes of an entrepreneur's movements, an entrepreneur's work. For instance, when we talk about the woman entrepreneur changing her style of presentation when she is presenting to a male group of investors, let's think about what the causes are. What is her context that makes her feel like that she may need to do that? The impacts on there. When we think about the entrepreneur relocating his business from one location to another in search of skilled labor, what is the impact of that? How does that affect the community? What sort of led him to make those sort of decisions? I was on the Baja Experience yesterday, and we had some entrepreneurs present to us some of the benefits of getting more experienced, and they wanted to say experienced and inexpensive labor in Mexico. So what's the impact on that? How does that impact the context there? And one of the things I would like to suggest that entrepreneurs do in this more dynamic or interactive view of context is that entrepreneurs are adapting to their contexts. They switch contexts in terms of deciding to be in one business area versus another business area. They change the context. One of the sponsors of this talk is an international organization, and entrepreneurs can move from one country to another. And that has reasons why they do that, and there's implications there. And then entrepreneurs also select their context as well. So far from it being a passive situation where an entrepreneur is purely impacted by the context, the entrepreneurs actively work to change and influence their circumstances. And I would argue that it works the other way around too, that there are certain circumstances in which certain people are able to or certain people in effect, selected to be entrepreneurs, who have access to certain resources. So you can say almost an environment is selecting some people to be certain entrepreneurs or certain types of entrepreneurs, to go in certain areas or not go into certain areas. The environment might be changing in response to certain activities in respect to those entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs who actively lobby government to make laws and changes that are different. So it's a two-way street. And I want to step back a little bit, because this is not a conversation that I started or something that I invented, but I want to sort of share with you the roots of this conversation, because nowadays we have more and more articles published on context than in a long period of time. And I want to suggest to you that the roots of that has to do with researchers and individuals who are interested in exploring entrepreneurship and ventures outside of the classic mold. Because these were researchers and entrepreneurs and community members that looked at what was being discussed or looked what's being highly valued in our society and said, wait a minute, that's not the whole picture. There's other entrepreneurial activity going on. And so the roots of our current focus on context has to do with developing from, subfields, what we call subfields: immigrant entrepreneurship, women's entrepreneurship, BIPOC and minority entrepreneurship, and BIPOC is Black, Indigenous, and people of color entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs that did not fit the classic mold of entrepreneurship. However, they are starting businesses, they're being successful, they're moving along the ventures. And so when people wanted to study those particular entrepreneurs or that particular type of entrepreneurship, they said, what's different? And a lot of what's different is the context. And so that's the roots of this thinking. And we talk about the classic mold. Let's talk about, define what that is. The classic mold of entrepreneurship, and here I'm borrowing some terminology from Baker and Welter. They call it nexus studies. And I'm sure you all this is familiar to you all. These are the classic mold: educationally and economically privileged founders. Founders that have been able to achieve quite a bit educationally, and often they come from relatively well-to-do families. Many of these founders are men, and they tend to develop non-family, profit-focused, high-growth, and high-employment ventures. This is where we get the Googles, the Amazons, the Stripes, okay? Generally in developed economies. And the focus is on financial returns. And in many of these studies, the whole idea of social structure and heterogeneity in the entrepreneur and their motivations is seriously downplayed. And let me clarify something before I go further. I have no problem with any of these ventures. If I had the opportunity to start the next Google, I would do it. No problem there. I guess what I'm simply saying is that that's not the whole and sum total of entrepreneurship. And if I didn't start the next Google, but chose to start a venture that was more focused on the local community so that I could spend time with my family, so I could spend more time being involved in certain community activities such as my church, I would not want those efforts looked down upon simply because I made a different set of choices or I had a different type of opportunity set. And that's why I think the real value lies in this conversation about context. It's that there's nothing wrong with Google, Stripe, Amazon, Tesla, all of those. More power to them. But they should not be elevated to the status of rock stars and having all other types of entrepreneurial activity ignored or downgraded. All of the types of entrepreneurship contribute to society. And I think we as entrepreneurial educators have the frontline seat in being able to start to begin this sort of broader sort of understanding of entrepreneurship, to start to inculcate that in our students, to sort of inculcate that in our consulting work and start to get the message out to the larger community. And so why do we want to go ahead and think about these other types of entrepreneurship that don't fit the classic mold? There's an argument, there's a famous article that talks about, it's from Shane and Venkataraman, that talks about we should not even pay attention to these non-employment ventures, or these ventures that are only employing one or two people, that they are really not worth the effort, and really not worth the investment into from the community. They're not generating the types of employment and financial returns that those two scholars think are critical. But I want to suggest that it's important that we expand our discussion beyond the 1% of venture capitalist funded ventures. That there's 99% of the firms out there that are operating, that are contributing to communities, that are providing social returns. We had an very interesting talk on social entrepreneurship, that are making contributions above and beyond what they're given credit for. Because suppose, let's say, all the only firms that we had in this country were, let's say, Stripe, Google, Amazon, and some fintechs. Our society would be completely hollowed out. So we as entrepreneurship educators need to encourage our students and encourage our community to really start to recognize the value and importance of these other sort of what I want to call non-classic ventures. And what I would like to suggest that one reason that these types of ventures, what we call Main Street or everyday, what I'm calling non-classic ventures, do not receive the significance that they deserve, is that because they are not studied and because they are compared against a set of contexts or a set of standards that where they don't fit, the effort, the ingenuity, the drive, and the contribution of these ventures is underestimated or neglected. And we serve a role of doing this. So we want to expand our discussion because it enriches the field. It encourages our students and our communities. I don't know about you, but most of the entrepreneurship students I teach and I work with, they're starting successful ventures, or they might do it later, but their ventures are not yet. I don't think I've yet taught someone who started something that's a Google or an Amazon. But I've taught a lot of people that have some thriving businesses that are improving their communities, that are providing stability for households, that are enabling people to work and grow in their self-esteem. So it encourages our students in our community. I mean, it's discouraging to me for me to talk to people, business owners in the community who feel they are not entrepreneurs because they don't fit that particular mold, okay? And then it acknowledges a wider range of contributions that the field of entrepreneurship is making, community-wise, individual-wise, and nationally. So the question becomes, if we agree that this is a worthy goal, how do we get there? How do we do it? And I just want to offer some ideas. This is by no means, I am no means standing up here as an expert, something that has this all figured out. But I do want to share some ideas that might stimulate, that you might find useful, and you might find that you might be able to adjust and stimulate some thinking of your own. So I'm suggesting that we want to focus in on change and interaction, because that's a big part of this, that it's not static, that the context influences how people respond to entrepreneurship and how they react to it and the choices they make. And also to start to consider the second order and longitudinal effects. So one way to do this in teaching is some tools I'm going to suggest here are thought experiments, interviews, and what-if scenarios. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. Thought experiment. This is one I think it's always interesting for my students to consider. I tell them, well, suppose Bill Gates, everyone's pretty much, many people are familiar with the story of Bill Gates, how he grew up in an upscale Seattle neighborhood. During the time when he was growing up, he was one of the first, he went to a school in which he was one of the first people exposed to computers. His school had computers when other schools, even certain businesses, didn't have computers. And then he went on to Harvard and dropped out of Harvard and went ahead and started Microsoft. So I say, well, let's take someone with that same drive, that same entrepreneurial drive, that same entrepreneurial brilliance, and let's say they were born in, let's say, Chicago public housing. Is anyone here from Chicago? All right, I lived in Chicago a long time, so I'm not throwing shade on Chicago public housing. I'm not doing that. But I think it's an example of taking the same entrepreneur and putting him or her in a different context. And the question becomes, what kind of venture would he create then? With that same drive, but access to a totally different set of circumstances, access to a totally different type of resources. And then I ask them to think about why. And this helps expose some of the underlying context or underlying privilege or underlying access that is often attributable to those entrepreneurs that do what we call, I'm quoting, nexus entrepreneurship, okay? Then I asked them to do another thought experience. Suppose there's an upscale neighborhood just like Bill Gates, but it was a Latina woman that was born into that family, into that situation. Would she be able to recreate Microsoft? And that's a big thought experience there. So it gets into how would she be perceived as a Latina? How would she be perceived as a woman? Would she still have access to some of the networks and resources and, let's say, subtle encouragement that someone like Bill Gates would? I look at recently we had Sam Bankman-Fried, and I think about, wow, that's incredible. Those billions of dollars. He was allowed a chance to fail. He was allowed a chance to have those billions of dollars. And then I think about certain other entrepreneurs that they're struggling to get a loan from the Small Business Administration, okay? So then I asked them to consider that, why or why not? Another teaching tool that I use is I ask my students to do some interviewing. Because I think interviewing is really helpful. I ask them to find an entrepreneur, find two. Find one which is their twin, or someone who's very similar to them. And ask them about their experiences. Ask them what obstacles they had to overcome, how they became a successful entrepreneur, what constraints did they face, what sort of factors enabled them to succeed. And then I asked them to find their quote-unquote opposite, someone that's very different from them. And I allow them to choose how they define what is opposite and what is similar. I review it to make sure it's somewhat in line. But maybe your opposite is someone that lives in a completely different neighborhood. Maybe your opposite is someone that's a different gender. Maybe your opposite is someone who's much older or much younger. And then ask them the same questions and see how you get those same results. And this all shows them how these different circumstances sort of flow through to different outcomes. And I think it gives them a very good appreciation of, even in the most difficult situations, persons that form businesses have done a tremendous feat. I just recall in one situation I had a guest speaker, a guest entrepreneur, come in. It was a black woman. She had her first child before she was 16. She subsequently had some other children before she was married. Yet and still, she built a thriving business. And now she is one of the consultants at a small business development center. And what was so amazing to me was that some of my students, who are relatively privileged compared to this lady, because they're young, they're in college, they don't have any children, they came out of that sessions having so much respect for her. They were like, wow, that's amazing. I couldn't have done that. And so that type of thing, that's an experience for them that I hope will carry them through and sort of let them sort of know, wow, it really is, all these good ventures count. And there's reasons why sometimes, even with the same drive or the same intelligence, that some people can be in certain situations and others are not. And that even if you're not in a particular situation, you're still making a value contribution to society. The next tool I use, I have them conduct a thought experiment. Now, this one is about jitney cabs. I don't know, has anyone been in some of the boroughs in New York? Remember the boroughs in New York? All right, okay, so I'm dating myself here, but it's okay. It was around, I guess, the 70s or so. I had family members who lived in Queens, the borough of Queens, New York. This was not a wealthy neighborhood. As a matter of fact, it was a neighborhood in which we would describe today as underserved, and people there had transportation issues. And that was back in the day when you had taxi cabs, but cabs would not come to this neighborhood. So what we had were enterprising individuals who had their cars, and they would pick up people and take them to the grocery store and take them to school and take them wherever they wanted to go for a fee. Okay? That was going on in the Queens borough. And now we have Lyft and Uber, which are doing the exact same thing, but on a much larger scale. And similarly, back in the day, we call them the boroughs of Queens, these underserved neighborhoods, they also would do shared rides. So let's say I don't have a car, I need to go to the grocery store, and so my neighbor would pick up, this jitney cab driver would come by and pick me up, and then also pick up my neighbor and some of my other people, and we would all go to the grocery store and they call them, get them to come back, and they all bring us back, the shared rides. Just like Uber and Lyft now. And I say, what are the big differences? Why is it that Uber and Lyft are huge today, and these jitney cab drivers are not? And it's not necessary. Some of it has to do with things like technology, but some of it has to do with access to knowledge, access to capital, education. And I would argue that the jitney cabs, when we think of innovation, I'm not throwing shade on Uber and Lyft. They are innovative. But I would say so are the jitney cab drivers providing a service there. So then I give them that exercise to have them sort of think more about what innovation is and where it happens, and why is it that innovation that happens in certain areas is able to get more resources than innovation that happens in other areas. Okay? And so to guide my students, I give them a kind of, this whole idea of context is sort of complex in a way. I give them just this basic level, this basic little framework to start thinking about it. Thinking about it because, in my view, context is everything that's outside of the entrepreneur. So to give them the idea, okay, macro, you can think about things. When you're looking at this, I want you to think about things at the macro level. The institutional system, state, policies, laws. Then I also want you to think about it at a meso level, differences in culture, neighborhood and communities. And then micro in terms of family, household, and education. This is just to give them a guide to start to think about, to try to break down this sort of big sort of idea of context and environment. And I'm not suggesting that this is the only way to look at it, but this is just one way that I've found helpful. And then we get into research. In my view, and this is just my opinion, context is a big, hairy, complicated, messy topic, okay? And so I think that makes it ideally suited for qualitative design, where you can go in and really sort of experience what the entrepreneurship experience, ask these in-depth questions, try to get a handle on some of the messiness and the complexity. Another part of research that is, I think, particularly suited to this area would be things that are experimental designs. And then, of course, I'm also thinking that this needs to be longitudinal in nature, to go over time, because some of the implications do not happen immediately, and some of the impacts of context were sort of built or developed historically and then flow on back. I was recently attending a session, it was the Los Angeles Business Journal, and they had a seminar, and an individual from the Department of Education was explaining how the system of roads and bridges impacts where and when and how businesses happen, okay? And so you come into that, and that's already part of the environment, but that influences the decisions that entrepreneurs make. And it certainly should be multi-level. You should have to look at like all those different levels I was talking about. So in terms of qualitative, I am not saying that good quantitative research cannot be done on context, but I think it's particularly suited for the holistic approaches, the deep insights, the focus on processes and responses makes it ideally suited for complex topics like looking at the environment and context. And some of the qualitative methods that I would think would be particularly useful would be phenomenology, ethnography, historical analysis, case studies, and grounded theory. Those are really, I think, great ideas for trying to get a hold of this particular type of topic. And then also experiments. Particularly designed experiments are excellent because you have controlled manipulation of what a perception of your subject is. How they perceive, how they evaluate people. This is one of the contexts that different entrepreneurs face is their responses when they approach people in certain situations, like going to a bank. We have the instance of the lady pitching in a pitch competition. Those types of things. It's particularly good for that. And it also is good for uncovering issues like unconscious benefits or unconscious biases. And then there's natural experiments before and after certain legislation. There was the recently passed Infrastructure Act that particularly devotes a pool of money for entrepreneurs to invest in electric vehicles and the electrification of society. Well, there's a certain portion of that money that's devoted to underserved communities. And lo and behold, we see a lot of entrepreneurs who are of BIPOC nature and entrepreneurs who feel like they have an expertise in that area going into those communities and starting businesses there. Now, other natural experiences are pandemics, wars. How does that influence the context? And then built landscape changes. And that's by no means a complete list, but hopefully it'll give you some ideas how to get started. And then there's other considerations for research there. I think it should be, in my opinion, it should be multi-level because that gives us a way to sort of look at the flow of some of these complex interactions. Ideally, it should be longitudinal because I think a lot of these impacts happen over time, particularly when you're talking about cultural differences and you're talking about societal impacts. And then I also could talk about constraints, things that keep people back, but also enablers, okay? some concluding thoughts on my prepared remarks here, and I hope you all have some other thoughts of your own, is that I think the whole idea of context is so important because it enables us to broaden the field of entrepreneurship. It enables us to reach more people. And it also enables us to learn patterns of success that can be applied across populations and across instances. And interviewing some entrepreneurs that are not necessarily fitting in the classic mold, they find so much creative ways to do workarounds on their constraints, how many ways they have learned to manage difficult situations. And I think there's all entrepreneurs that have a lot to learn from one another. Just like our Nexus entrepreneurs that I don't want to feel like I'm putting shade on those because I'm right in there to do the next Microsoft, so sign me up. But there's so much that they can teach other entrepreneurs about access to capital, access to information, and similarly that quote-unquote Main Street entrepreneurs can teach them as well. So my goal is to sort of share some of these thoughts that I've had. I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and I'm open to any questions. Okay. Martina?
From your perspective as a journal editor, what would be sort of maybe example of the most burning research question that would take context into account?
There's so many burning questions here. One of the burning questions that I would have would to have people investigate more how entrepreneurs respond to, let's say, negative changes in their context. How do they respond to these difficulties and those setbacks? How do they work around situations that could be seemingly very difficult or impossible or immovable? That's why I would like to see that. I'd also see part of it is the question, but another part of it is the methodology. I would like to see a series of multiple longitudinal case studies on how entrepreneurs overcame those obstacles and what we can learn from them. Thank you. Other questions?
Thank you for this presentation and to introduce again the context point of view. And we also seen the kaleidoscopic point of view of the context. And we were just teaching to our students and working so much around ecosystem. So, what links ecosystem to context?
Okay, great question. Thank you so much. I guess in my view, when I think about ecosystem, I think more about, like, say, individual players and individual institutions and those linkages there. So I would consider, in my point of view, the ecosystem just to be a part of the larger context there, that there are other factors involved as well.
What about luck related to context?
Well, I think luck is important. I might rephrase it and call it timing. But I think sometimes there's reasons why certain people are in certain places at the right time. And that is often built up on or the result of different factors at play that may have been, that are currently in play or previously in play. So for example, I mean, if you're in a situation like we talked about, let's say Bill Gates in the housing project, luck is not going to affect that much. But I mean, if he's in another context, then he will have access to that, for sure. So I think timing is important. Timing is a key part of it. I mean, I think one of the reasons why Uber and Lyft came about because they had the technology available. The technology was available to really work with that. But I think what the other piece of it is is that sometimes, even with timing, let's say access to technology and access to information and access to resources, there's other factors in play that enable people to be able to take advantage of that type of timing. And then also timing has to do with, even if you're not talking about, let's say, nexus entrepreneurship per se, timing is always, I guess, also an issue when you're looking at the needs of the community to try to answer the community. So timing is an important part of the context here. And then the framework I put up, I'm not claiming that that is the ultimate framework, because there's many frameworks, but you can certainly look at all those factors and include timing in there as well, particularly when you're doing your research or when you're presenting projects and skills and exercises to your students. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I have a very practical question about when you use the tools in the classroom. So maybe, when have you found them the most successful? Give it in the context of the class and the timing.
Okay, that's good in the context of the class. I find it most successful with MBA students. Partly, one practical reason is that they have are more likely to have access to entrepreneurs that they can interview. And they very often have a broader set of background, a broader set of experience to sort of lay their findings upon. You know, it's kind of like if you know something, it's easier to learn more about it. So I find it very effective with the MBA students. However, with the undergraduate students, the whole idea with the switching with the Bill Gates and the Latino woman, I find that very effective, and also the interviews of students at all levels. One place I like to place it in terms of context is I like to try to do it towards the beginning of the course. Because when I'm teaching entrepreneurship, I ask a question, what is entrepreneurship? And it's starting something new. And so I like to put it at the beginning of the course so that people can broaden their idea about what entrepreneurship is. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you. We're putting together a database of different entrepreneurs to try to find some that are less represented by the stereotype. And one of the criteria I've been asked to do is to think about, what is their success? And, how do we define success? Or do you have any ideas on that when it's not evidently monetary? Maybe success is that you just didn't have to find a job or something.
Right. So your database, from what I'm gathering, it looks like it's a quantitative database?
No, qualitative.
Well,
By database, I mean a collection of case studies, if you will, of different entrepreneurs representing different backgrounds.
Because some of these motivations for entrepreneurships and some of these definitions for success are not easily quantifiable. A lot of them has to do with, let's say, the personal goals of the entrepreneur. I want to spend time with my family. I want to contribute to my community. I think you have to eventually just ask them, is your venture successful? Why is it successful? What do you consider success? I mean, and I realize that's an awful lot of work to do to try to interview people individually, but it might be a situation where you could survey them. Send out a survey, and how are you defining success? And then from there, you can see various levels of success right there.
Thank you.
Okay, I think this will be my final question. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Thank you for a great presentation, Lois. My question is, in the motivation of how much thought switching would the law of attraction have to do with motivation? In other words, if you're sending out the cause and you want the effect, and I think there's a role to be played in someone deliberately pursuing, a goal and then attracting some of the effects.
I agree with that, and I think that on one level, if you do not try, let's say I want to start a business, but I stay home every day and I'm eating chocolates and watching TV, nothing's going to happen. So that is part of it, but I think what's interesting is that if you have people, let's say, putting forth, and this is always hard to quantify, comparable levels of effort, and what are some of the reasons that one might be more successful than the other? It might be one has a better idea, because that person, that woman has better access to information. It might be that another person, they really are trying, but let's say they can't get a bank loan, but they go ahead and they get angel funding, or let's say they go to a community organization and get funding there. So I want to definitely agree with you that the efforts of the different entrepreneurs is very critical, but sometimes those efforts result in differential outcomes. And so it's interesting to see how the context might affect that. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. I am getting the 2-minute warning here. So I do want to thank you all for spending your time here, asking questions and listening to me. I have my email there, and I'm going to be at the rest of the conference, so I'd be love to speak with anyone else. Thank you so much.